There is a question that follows Maren Solvik's name in every county record, touching the years between 1962 and 1991. And the question is this: why would a woman in her right mind spend $35 on 26 cattle so thin you could read their ribs like the pages of an open book? The auction men at Glenvar that October morning asked it aloud. The feed store owner on Route 9 asked it with his eyes. The county extension agent, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Ferris, who had never in his professional life been wrong about what a piece of land could bear, asked it with his whole body, standing at the fence line of the Solvik parcel with his clipboard held flat against his chest like a shield. Why would she do it? 26 animals that no one else would bid on. $35 total, which worked out to just over $1.33 per head. The auction floor had gone so quiet when the hammer dropped that people standing outside could hear it through the wall. She loaded them herself, 3 trips in a borrowed trailer, driving a truck with a cracked side mirror, and when she got them home, she turned them loose on ground that every sensible person in Harlan County believed was ruined. She did not explain herself. She never did. That was the thing about Maren Solvik that people would try to account for later, when accounting for her became necessary. She had a way of receiving an opinion as though it were weather, something to note and then disregard if it did not agree with what the deeper instruments were reading. Her father had been the same, his father before him. There was a stubbornness in that bloodline that looked from the outside exactly like grief or confusion, and for a long time the county was content to let it be one of those things. She was 62 years old that autumn, newly widowed, and the parcel she had inherited from her husband's estate was 412 acres of post-mining land in the high foothills, stripped of its topsoil in places, compacted to near concrete hardness in others, carrying a legal notation in the county assessor's file that read, in plain bureaucratic language, unsuitable for agricultural use pending remediation. That notation had been there since 1957. No one had ever challenged it. Dale Ferris had, in fact, cited it to Maren directly the week before the auction, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold between his hands, explaining in the careful, padded way of a man who considers himself to be doing someone a kindness that she was looking at a minimum of 20 years and somewhere north of $80,000 in soil amendment before that ground would carry a productive herd. She had thanked him for the coffee cup and stood up, which he had taken as agreement. It was not agreement. It was the particular silence of a woman who has already done the arithmetic and found the other person's figures irrelevant. That was October. By the following March, the 26 heifers were on grass, and the grass was green, and Dale Ferris would not drive past the Solvik gate for 6 months because he could not make himself look at it. But that is getting ahead of the story, and the story, to be understood at all, has to start where Maren started it, not at the auction and not at the fence line, but 22 inches underground. Her grandfather Einar Solvik had come to Harlan County in 1894 with a surveying chain, a hand-drawn map of the hydrological formations he had studied in the coastal ranges, and a conviction, developed over a lifetime of watching water move through difficult land, that the high foothills concealed a perched aquifer of considerable size that drained, seasonally, through a network of subsurface channels toward the valley floor. He had written this down in a series of small cloth-bound notebooks, 61 of them in all, filled with observations, measurements, hand-drawn cross-sections, and occasional lines of Norwegian that his granddaughter Maren had grown up reading aloud at the kitchen table as though they were verses from something old and binding. The notebooks were kept in a cedar box under the stair landing of the farmhouse that had stood on the property adjacent to the mining parcel, and Maren had been reading them since she was 9 years old, sitting on the floor beside the box with a candle in a jar because the stair landing had no window. Her grandfather's handwriting was precise and small and slightly canted to the left, the way of a man who learned penmanship young and never saw any reason to deviate from what he had been taught. His central argument, repeated in varying forms across 3 decades of observation, was simple enough to write on a matchbook. Water does not disappear. It only learns new paths. This was the refrain that Maren carried. She had first heard it from her father, who had heard it from his father, who had written it in the 61st notebook in the last entry he made before his hands grew too unsteady for the small writing. Water does not disappear. It only learns new paths. It meant something specific in the technical sense, referring to the way subsurface drainage systems rerouted themselves when overlying soil was compacted or stripped, going deeper rather than ceasing, becoming invisible rather than absent. But it also meant something that Maren felt more than she could articulate, something about the persistence of what has been driven underground, the way a thing denied its surface expression does not die but only goes quiet and waits. She did not say this to Dale Ferris. She did not say it to anyone. She went outside and looked at the ground. What Einar's notebooks described and what Maren had spent the first 3 months of her widowhood quietly verifying was that the subsurface drainage beneath the mining parcel had not been destroyed by the extraction operations. It had been compressed. The overburden compaction had forced the perched aquifer down by an estimated 14 to 20 inches, which meant it still existed, still moved, still held water through the dry months, but expressed itself at no point on the surface that any casual observer would recognize as significant. The former operators of the mine had not known it was there. The county assessment had not tested for it. Dale Ferris's remediation figure had been calculated without it. What it meant, in practical terms, was that the parcel was not a dead piece of ground that needed $80,000 and 2 decades of amendment. It was a living piece of ground that needed primarily something to break the compaction and allow the water already present in the system to surface and move freely again. The most cost-effective tool available for compaction fracture at depth was not a mechanical aerator, which could not reach deep enough without destroying remaining subsoil structure. It was a set of hooves. Specifically, it was the repeated, patient, managed movement of hooves across compacted ground over the course of 1 to 3 growing seasons, which was the same conclusion Einar had written in Notebook 37 in 1931, watching the ground recover on a similarly treated hillside 40 miles south where no one had thought to look. 26 starving heifers at $1.33 per head. That was the arithmetic. That was the answer to the question. She was not being sentimental. She was not grieving her husband in some misdirected pastoral direction. She was executing a plan written in a cedar box under the stairs 70 years before she needed it. The first person to arrive and witness the early work was Maren's nearest neighbor, a woman named Phyllis Crane, who brought a covered dish of scalloped potatoes and stood at the fence for 15 minutes watching Maren move the herd in slow rotational passes across the lower field. Phyllis had a warm face and good intentions, and she set the dish on the fence post and said, in the particular tone of a person who has decided to treat catastrophe as eccentricity, that she thought it was good for Maren to have something to tend to in the difficult time. Maren looked at the herd and looked at Phyllis and said the lower field would need 3 more passes before she moved them north. Phyllis took her dish home untouched and told her husband that Maren Solvik had gone strange with grief. This was the kindest available reading, and the county adopted it. The second visitor was a man from the Regional Land Improvement Bureau, sent following a neighbor's informal inquiry about whether any welfare check might be warranted, given the livestock situation. He drove a clean truck with a government seal on the door, and he stood with his boots exactly at the property line, as though the ground might be contagious, and he explained, in the language of someone reading from a printed sheet of talking points, that the land classification meant she could not legally graze cattle on the parcel for commercial purposes until remediation certification was complete, and that running animals on compacted post-extraction soil could, in fact, worsen the compaction profile in certain conditions, which statement was technically true in the same way that a broken clock is technically right twice per day. And Maren said yes, thank you, and moved the herd to the middle field, which was on the adjacent property she also owned and which carried no such classification. He left satisfied that he had been heard. She moved them back to the mining parcel the following week, to a section that her grandfather's notebook 39 described as directly over the second lateral channel, and she drove them in slow circles until the ground smelled different. She knew what the different smell meant. Einar had described it. She did not write it down because she did not need to. Dale Ferris came back in February, 8 months after his kitchen table visit, because he had been asked to provide an updated land assessment for the county's rolling agricultural review. He stood at the same fence line with the same clipboard, and he looked at the same ground, and he was quiet for longer than was comfortable for either of them. Then he said that some of the compaction appeared to have ameliorated, which was interesting, and that he could not account for it with the moisture figures from the previous autumn, which had been near average. Marin said the water was already there. He wrote something on his clipboard. He said that he stood by his earlier remediation estimate, adjusted perhaps for the apparent surface improvement, call it $55,000 over 15 years rather than $80,000 over 20 years. He said this in the careful tone of a man offering a revised and more favorable verdict, and there was a kindness in his voice that was harder to absorb than open dismissal because it required her to be grateful for a figure that was still entirely wrong. She said thank you and went inside. He drove away feeling that he had done well. She sat at the kitchen table and opened Notebook 44 and read the same passage she had read the night before. Einar's description of the way the lower lateral would express itself at the surface when compaction eased past a certain threshold, which he had calculated to occur between the 14th and 18th month of managed hoof pressure, and she counted forward on the calendar and found that she had roughly 3 months to wait. The person who understood, and understood without being told, was a young man named Cass Beaumont, who appeared at her gate on a Wednesday in early spring with a bedroll and a working knowledge of cattle that he had arrived at the hard way, through 8 years of itinerant ranch labor across 4 states, and no particular plan beyond the gate in front of him. He had pulled off the county road because he had seen the herd moving and recognized, in the pattern of their movement, that they were being worked deliberately. He did not know why. He could see that the ground beneath them was being asked a specific question. He was not certain what question, but he could see the logic of asking it. He stood at the gate for some time before Marin came out of the barn. He said he was looking for work. She said she could pay him in meals and the use of the tack room until she knew what the land was going to do. He said that sounded like a reasonable arrangement. They shook hands, and that was the entire negotiation. Cass learned the notebook system within a fortnight. Not the Norwegian, which defeated him, but the logic beneath the Norwegian, which Marin translated in the flat factual sentences she favored. The lateral runs here. Einar measured the recharge rate at this point. The threshold depth for surface expression is somewhere between 22 and 26 inches. We drive the animals in this pattern to fracture the compaction layer evenly rather than in channels. He listened with the quality of attention that working animals listen with, total and without editorial comment. He moved the herd where she pointed. He rose before dawn and checked the fence lines without being asked. In the evenings, he read the notebook she set out, running his finger under the numbers, teaching himself to trust the figures of a man dead for 30 years whose observations had been made with instruments no more sophisticated than a calibrated rod and a great deal of patience. The other thing Cass did, which Marin had not anticipated and which became, in retrospect, as important as anything else in those middle months, was notice the depression. It was in the southwest corner of the parcel, near where the old extraction road had been graded flat and then abandoned, a shallow concave feature in the ground roughly 14 feet across that remained wet longer after rain than the surrounding surface, and that had, around its inner edge, the faint remains of a stone foundation. He brought Marin to it on a Thursday afternoon in late June, pointing without speaking. She stood at the edge of the depression and looked at the stonework, and then she got down on one knee and cleared some of the grass away with her hand and found the corner joint, 2 courses of fitted limestone, the craftsmanship of someone who had known what they were doing and had expected the work to last. She knew from her grandfather's first notebook, written in the year of his arrival, that there had been a prospector's cabin on the southwest corner of the upper parcel, built in the 1870s and abandoned before 1890 when the first extraction company came through. Einar had noted it as a landmark for his hydrological measurements. The extraction operations had buried it under 20 years of graded spoil. It had been lost. She looked at the foundation, and then she looked at the wet margin of the depression, and understood that the water was beginning to rise, because this corner sat directly over the junction of the first and second lateral channels, and if the compaction had fractured sufficiently, this was exactly where expression would first appear. She stood up and looked at Cass and said they would bring the herd up here every other day for the next 6 weeks. He said, "Starting tomorrow." She said, "Starting today." By late August, the ground in the southwest corner was seeping. Not running, not flowing, but holding a surface moisture through days without rain that it had not held in living memory. The grass there was a noticeably deeper green than the surrounding field, visible from the road if you knew what you were looking at, which no one did yet. The heifers, who had come to them in October of the previous year as walking anatomical diagrams, were cattle now, filled out and easy-moving and carrying enough condition that the same auction men who had watched Marin load them for $1.33 per head would not have recognized them as the same animals. Cass kept a hand-ruled ledger in the tack room with the daily weights and the pasture condition scores and the rainfall figures, the same categories Einar had tracked in his notebooks, updated with equipment Einar had not had access to but would have recognized the purpose of immediately. The ledger and the notebooks were, Marin felt, in conversation with each other across 90 years, and she was the medium through which they spoke. The county extension office published its regional agricultural outlook in September of that year. Dale Ferris had written the section covering the high foothill properties, and his assessment of the Solvik parcel noted encouraging early signs of voluntary surface compaction amelioration, which he attributed to favorable seasonal moisture patterns, and suggested that with appropriate professional intervention, the remediation timeline might be reduced to 10 to 12 years. The document was distributed to all property owners in the district. Marin filed her copy in the cedar box alongside the notebooks. She did not respond to it. What she was watching in those September weeks was the pressure. It was building in the way Einar had described pressure building in Notebook 53, which he had written not from observation of the Harlan County parcels, but from memory of a similar system he had studied as a young man in Norway, a hillside aquifer that had been driven deep by agricultural compaction and had taken 14 years to reassert itself at the surface, emerging finally not in the original drainage channels but in 3 new locations, with sufficient force to flood a root cellar and carry a stone wall 12 feet from its original position. His observation from that event, written in the margin of the page in smaller letters than the main text, as though added later when the lesson had fully arrived, was that water does not remember the path, only the destination. He meant that the water did not try to return to where it had come from. It went to where the pressure differential allowed it to go, which might be somewhere that no map had previously marked. This was useful to know. Marin found it useful. She marked the 3 likeliest new surface points on a hand-drawn map she kept folded inside the front cover of Notebook 53, and in early October she drove a series of shallow drainage guides with a long-handled spade, 3 inches deep and angled toward the natural grade, so that when the water arrived it would move in an orderly direction rather than pooling flat. She did this at night, 3 nights in a row, because she had found over the previous year that the work she did after dark was less likely to generate the kind of attention that generated visitors with clipboards. The autumn that followed was the driest on record in Harlan County since 1934. The meteorological figures, which were later cited in the county's formal disaster assessment, showed a precipitation deficit of 63% against the 30-year average between July and November. The valley floor farms, which depended on surface irrigation drawn from 2 reservoir systems that had been built in the 1940s and managed to full supply levels by an infrastructure authority that had, over the course of 3 consecutive wet decades, forgotten that the reservoirs had a finite capacity, went into distress by August and into crisis by mid-October. The Irrigation Authority's director, a man named Gerald Birch, who had managed the district for 19 years, and who had told the county commissioners in his annual report for each of those 19 years that the system was adequate to handle any foreseeable drought scenario, held a public meeting in the second week of October at which he used the word unprecedented 7 times and the phrase outside our modeling parameters 4 times, and during which he said, with a directness that his public manner rarely permitted, that he did not know how they were going to get the valley floor herds through the winter. Gerald Birch was the man who had stood at Marin's fence in the winter of 1962, before his appointment to the authority directorship, when he had been Dale Ferris's supervisor and had come along on the assessment visit as a courtesy. He had said nothing at the fence line beyond a brief observation that the parcel reminded him of some worked-out coal country he had seen in the east, uniformly grim and uniformly unrecoverable in any near-term sense. He had not intended the observation as cruelty. It had been delivered in the mild, informational tone of a man who considers himself to be providing a useful orientation to reality. Marin had said nothing to him, which he had taken as acceptance. He had not been back since. The morning after the public meeting, which Marin had not attended because she had been moving the herd to the southwest corner to drink from the seep that had by then widened to a slow, clear, ground-level flow approximately 8 feet across and 3 inches deep, constant through 6 weeks without rain, Cass came back from town with news of what had been said. He stood in the barn doorway and recounted it in the same flat register he used for reporting fence conditions. Marin listened with her back to him, running a brush along the neck of the nearest heifer. She said that the second lateral had probably opened sometime in the last 10 days, which would increase the flow in the southwest seep. He said he would check the rate this afternoon. She said yes. That was the end of the conversation. She had never wanted anyone to be ruined. That requires stating plainly because the sequence of events that followed carries a shape that could be mistaken for satisfaction if you do not know the person. What she felt when Cass told her about Gerald Birch standing at the podium using the word unprecedented was not satisfaction. It was the particular heaviness of having been right about something for a long time and finding that being right offers no protection to anyone who has not listened. The water did not disappear. It had only learned new paths. And now the people who had spent 19 years building their livelihoods on the assumption that the surface water infrastructure was sufficient were discovering that assumption at the worst possible time and in the worst possible way. And there was no comfort available in the fact that she had known this could happen, because knowing it had not made it not happen. The Southwest Seep was, by the third week of October, producing a measurable flow of approximately 40 gallons per hour. This was not a river. It was not a dramatic eruption. It was a steady, quiet, ground-level emergence of cold, clear water from the junction of the first and second subsurface laterals, exactly where Einar Solvik's Notebook 49 had predicted it would emerge if the compaction was relieved and the recharge cycle was uninterrupted over a period of 14 to 20 months. It had been 23 months. The extra 9 months represented the additional compaction depth imposed by the final extraction operations in 1957, which Einar had not been alive to observe, but which his framework had accommodated without difficulty because he had built the framework around the behavior of water, and water does not change its behavior to accommodate human timelines. The flow held constant through a week of continued dry weather, held through the first freeze and the partial thaw that followed, held through a second freeze, held. Cass checked it every morning at the same time and entered the figure in the ledger in the column beside the rainfall. 0, 0, 0, 0. Water, 41, 40, 43, 42. The ground was giving what the sky was not. That was the whole design. Gerald Birch arrived at the Solvik gate on a Tuesday in early November. He came alone, without a clipboard. He was driving his personal truck rather than the authority vehicle, which said something, though Marin would not have said it aloud. She watched him come up the lane from the kitchen window, and then she put her coat on and went out to meet him before he reached the door, because she did not want this conversation to happen in her kitchen. He looked older than she remembered from the fence line visit, though 8 years was 8 years, and she supposed she looked different to him as well. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked past her toward the southwest corner where the seep was visible from this distance as a darkened area in the otherwise uniformly dry and brown late autumn field, and his cattle would have been obvious to him. 26 animals in good flesh, grazing with the easy confidence of animals that know their water supply is reliable. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had heard she had water. She said yes. He said he didn't know how that was possible given the conditions. She said it had been there for a long time. He was quiet again. Then he said, in the halting, effortful way of a man paying a debt he would rather not have incurred, that he thought he had misjudged the parcel, that he thought she had known something he had not. He did not say more than that. He was not a man built for extended apology, and she did not require it to be extended. She said she could take 30 head, maybe 35, through the winter on the existing flow. She did not say she was offering. She let the number sit between them until he understood what it was. He asked what she would want for it. She said she would want the county to reclassify the parcel. He said he thought that could be arranged. It was arranged. It was arranged in December, which was faster than the county normally arranged anything, which suggested that Gerald Birch had called in something to make it happen, which told Marin something about how he assessed what he owed. She accepted the reclassification without comment. She accepted 31 head of valley cattle into the southwest corner on an informal grazing agreement written on one page of a legal pad, 31 head through the winter, at a fee that covered Cass's wages and nothing else, which was not enough and which she knew was not enough and which she set at that level, because she had not started this in order to profit from someone else's crisis, and she was not going to finish it that way. She wrote to each of the 12 valley operators whose cattle she was not able to accommodate and provided them with Einar's methodology in plain English, one page each, the key measurements, the compaction fracture principle, the managed hoof pressure technique, the identification markers for subsurface lateral systems in similar geological contexts. She did not include the notebooks themselves, which were irreplaceable, but she had Cass copy out the relevant passages in a clear hand, and she included those. She did not expect most of them to act on it in time to matter for this particular winter. She expected some of them to put it in a drawer and find it years later when it was relevant, and she thought that was all right. The water was already there. It only needed someone to look for it with the right instruments and the right patience, and she could not provide the patience, only the instruments. 2 of the valley operators wrote back. One of them asked if she would be willing to come and look at his ground the following spring. She said she would, and she went, and she found a lateral system that Einar's general maps had suggested was likely in that area, running shallower than on her parcel, and less extensively, but real and recoverable. And she told the man what she saw and how she would proceed if it were her ground. He proceeded accordingly. It took him 4 years rather than 2 because he was working with fewer animals and was unwilling to graze the compacted sections at the density she recommended, which was a reasonable caution for a man who had not grown up with Einar Solvik's notebooks, and she did not press him. He had the patience. He was only lacking the starting point. She gave him the starting point and got out of the way. Cass Beaumont stayed on through the reclassification and through the following spring and through the summer after that, and by the 3rd year he had ceased to be itinerant in any meaningful sense, though neither he nor Marin formally acknowledged the permanence of the arrangement, because neither of them was built for that kind of acknowledgement, and neither needed the acknowledgement in order to rely on it. He took over the ledger management entirely and began annotating it in the same style as the notebooks, dated entries with precise measurements and occasional marginal observations, in the careful hand he had taught himself by copying Einar's numbers until the habit of precision was embedded. Marin read his entries the way she had read her grandfather's, sitting at the kitchen table with good morning light, working her way through the figures and finding, in the regularity of them, the proof that something had been established. Not just on her parcel, in the practice, in the methodology, in the idea that the ground held knowledge that the surface record did not show, and that a sufficiently patient person with sufficiently old instruments could surface that knowledge the same way the water surfaced, not by forcing it, but by relieving the pressure that kept it down. The southwest corner of the parcel was fenced separately beginning in 1967 and designated on the working maps as Einar's Point, a name that Cass introduced without discussion and that Marin accepted without discussion, and that appeared on the County Agricultural Survey of 1974 as the formal designation for the spring feature and associated pasture, which by that date supported a year-round herd of 64 head and produced enough overflow to supply water to the adjacent Crane property by arrangement, without diminishing the primary herd's access. Phyllis Crane, who had brought the scalloped potatoes in 1962, never remarked on this arrangement in a way that acknowledged what it cost or what it represented. She referred to it as Marin's Spring, which was accurate, and she used the water with the casual appreciation of a person who has not had to work for a thing, and therefore does not fully register what work produced it. Marin did not require her to register it. The water ran regardless. The cabin foundation was excavated properly in 1969 by a county historical survey team that Cass had contacted after the surface seep stabilized the moisture levels in the southwest corner sufficiently to allow safe excavation without slumping. The limestone corners came up cleanly. The structure had been approximately 12 by 18 feet, a single-room prospecting cabin built sometime between 1868 and 1878 by a person who had left no name in any record, but who had fitted the stones with a skill suggesting either professional training or a long apprenticeship in masonry, and who had, in the northwest interior corner, set a flat capstone over a small storage cavity. The cavity contained a tin box. The tin box contained, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them against the moisture of 90 years underground, a surveying journal, and a set of hand-drawn maps showing the subsurface water features of the high foothill section of Harlan County, labeled in a precise, left-canted hand that Marin recognized before the archaeologist finished unfolding the first page. Einar Solvik. Year of arrival, 1894. The cabin had been his first field station. He had sealed his earliest observations in the capstone cavity before building the farmhouse and establishing the cedar box archive, keeping a working copy at the farmhouse and a backup, it appeared, underground, in the limestone cavity that had outlasted the cabin and the mine and everything else except the water the maps described. Water does not disappear, it only learns new paths. He had written it inside the front cover of the tin box journal, the first place he had written it, before he had written it in any of the 61 notebooks. It was the oldest version of the sentence. It was the original. The archaeologist asked if she wanted to keep it, and she said yes. Dale Ferris retired from the Extension Service in 1978. His farewell address to the County Agricultural Board included an account of the Solvik parcel that ran for 4 paragraphs, and that described the surface compaction amelioration as a case study in the underappreciated potential of managed livestock pressure in post-extraction rehabilitation contexts, which was accurate in the way that a description of a river as water moving between banks is accurate. He did not mention Einar Solvik's notebooks. He may not have known about them. He credited the recovery to Marin's instinctive husbandry practices and to favorable hydrological conditions in the relevant years, which was the interpretation available to him and which he offered in good faith. Marin was not present at the address. She was in the southwest pasture, moving the herd. She began teaching the notebook methodology formally in 1979, at the request of the Agricultural Extension Program at the Land Grant College 40 miles south, which had learned about the Solvik parcel through a graduate student's thesis on post-mining land recovery in the high foothill region. The thesis had cited the 61 notebooks and the tin box journal and the Einar Solvik hydrological maps as primary sources, and the extension program director, a woman who knew what primary sources were worth, had written to Marin asking if she would be willing to discuss the methodology with students. Marin said she would discuss what she could observe and what Einar had measured. The director said that was exactly what they were asking for. Marin drove down on 4 Thursdays in the spring of 1979 and sat at the front of a classroom and answered questions in the flat, factual sentences that had always been her register, and the students, who had expected something else, took a few minutes to calibrate to it and then, once calibrated, found that they could not get enough of it, because she was telling them something that their coursework had not told them, which was that the ground held a longer record than any assessment could capture, and that the methodology for reading that record was older than the assessment tools and more reliable, and that the instruments required were patience and old notebooks and a willingness to move cattle in circles before anyone could see the reason. Cass Beaumont taught the same course from 1984 through 2003. He brought the notebooks and the ledger to each session. He brought, in later years, a laminated copy of the capstone map from the Tin Box Journal, which the County Historical Society had photographed and preserved, and which showed in Einar's precise hand the full subsurface drainage network of the high foothill section as Einar had understood it in 1894, a document that the county's current geological survey, conducted in 1991 with modern equipment and a significant budget, confirmed in all essential particulars. The Geological Survey report noted in its concluding section that the pre-existing hand-drawn hydrological record, attributed to Einar J. Solvik, Norwegian emigrant surveyor, circa 1894 to 1931, represented an extraordinary example of field observation methodology producing results comparable to those achieved by contemporary instrumented survey, and recommended that the Solvik notebooks be digitized and preserved as a primary historical and scientific resource. They were digitized in 1994. They are held currently at the County Historical Archive and at the Land-Grant College Library in facsimile, and the original cedar box and its contents, along with the Tin Box Journal and the capstone maps, are in a climate-controlled case in the college's agricultural history collection, labeled with a card written in Marin's handwriting, plain and direct as everything she ever said. Einar Solvik's Observations, Harlan County High Foothill Section, 79 years of field measurement. The water was always there. She died in 1991 at the age of 91 at the farmhouse. Cass was there. The herd was in the southwest pasture. The seep at Einar's Point was running at its usual rate, which had held, with seasonal variation, within the range Einar had calculated for a fully recovered lateral system for 22 consecutive years. She had asked, some years before, that her name not be placed on a marker at the parcel, because the parcel already had a marker, and because the work did not require her name to stand, only the water to run. The marker that stands at Einar's Point is a flat piece of native limestone, fitted into the northeast edge of the old cabin foundation by Cass Beaumont in the autumn of 1991, and on it, carved in the same style as the corner joints of the foundation beside it, are 11 words. They are her grandfather's words, the ones she read first at 9 years old by candlelight, the ones she carried through 28 years of compacted ground and empty skies and clipboards held like shields, the ones she left behind when there was nothing left to carry. Water does not disappear. It only learns new paths,